The missing gold coin. The sun was setting over the quaint little town of Maplewood, casting a warm golden glow over the cobblestone streets. Samson, a curious and bright-eyed 12-year-old, sat on the porch of his grandfather's house, swinging his legs as he watched the world go by. His grandfather, Mr. Thompson, was in his usual spot, sitting in his old wooden rocking chair, puffing on his pipe and gazing out at the horizon. Samson had always admired his grandfather. Mr. Thompson was a man of few words, but when he spoke, everyone listened. He had a quiet strength about him, a kind of wisdom that came from a lifetime of experiences. Samson often wondered what it would be like to be as calm and composed as his grandfather, especially in the face of challenges. As they sat in comfortable silence, the sound of hurried footsteps broke the peace. Samson's grandmother, Mrs. Thompson, came rushing out of the house, her face pale with worry. "Thomas," she exclaimed, addressing her husband by his first name, which she only used when something serious was happening. "It's gone. The gold coin is gone." Mr. Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly as he took the pipe out of his mouth and set it down on the small table beside him. He turned to his wife with a calm but concerned expression. "Are you sure, Margaret?" he asked gently. "Yes, I'm sure," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice trembling. "I was just dusting the shelf where we keep it, and it's not there. Someone must have taken it." Samson felt a pang of anxiety in his chest. The gold coin was a family heirloom, passed down through generations. It had been in the Thompson family for over 100 years, and its sentimental value far outweighed its monetary worth. Samson had always been fascinated by the coin, with its intricate design and the sense of history it carried. The thought of it being stolen made his stomach churn. Mr. Thompson, however, remained calm. He stood up from his chair and walked over to his wife, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, Margaret. We'll get to the bottom of this," he said with quiet confidence. Turning to Samson, Mr. Thompson gave him a knowing look. "Come with me, Samson. I think it's time you learned something important." Curiosity piqued, Samson quickly followed his grandfather as they made their way into the house. Mr. Thompson led him to the living room, where the old wooden shelf stood, now empty of its prized possession. Samson noticed that the dust had been disturbed, confirming that someone had indeed taken the coin. "Who do you think took it, Grandpa?" Samson asked, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. Mr. Thompson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the large bay window that overlooked the street and gazed out thoughtfully. After a moment, he spoke. "Samson, there are two types of people in this world, those who act out of greed and those who act out of need. The trick is to understand which one you're dealing with before deciding how to respond." Samson furrowed his brow, trying to make sense of his grandfather's words. "But how do you know which one it is?" Mr. Thompson smiled slightly. "You pay attention to the details. You listen. And sometimes you have to set a trap, not to catch them, but to help them see the error of their ways." With that, Mr. Thompson turned away from the window and headed towards the front door. "Come on, Samson. Let's take a walk." Confused but intrigued, Samson followed his grandfather out the door and down the cobblestone path that led into town. The streets were quiet, with only a few people milling about. As they walked, Mr. Thompson seemed to be deep in thought, his eyes scanning their surroundings with an intensity that Samson had rarely seen before. Eventually, they reached the small general store at the center of town. Mr. Thompson pushed open the door, and a small bell jingled as they entered. The store was dimly lit, with shelves lined with all sorts of goods, from canned food to tools and trinkets. Behind the counter stood Mr. Harris, the store's owner, a gruff-looking man with a thick mustache and a suspicious glint in his eye. "Afternoon, Thompson," Mr. Harris greeted, though his tone was anything but friendly. "What brings you here today?" Mr. Thompson gave a polite nod. "Afternoon, Harris. I was hoping you might have seen or heard something unusual in the past day or so." Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "Unusual? Can't say I have." "Why, what's the matter?" "Someone took something very valuable from my house," Mr. Thompson said, his voice calm but firm. An old gold coin that's been in my family for generations. I was wondering if anyone might have come by trying to sell it or pawn it off. Mr. Harris's eyes flickered for a moment, and Samson noticed the slightest hint of unease in the man's expression. But Mr. Harris quickly masked it with a shrug. Haven't seen or heard anything about a gold coin, he said, avoiding Mr. Thompson's gaze. Sorry, Thompson, but I can't help you. Mr. Thompson didn't press further. He simply nodded and turned to leave. Thank you, Harris. If you do hear anything, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know. As they walked back out into the street, Samson couldn't help but feel disappointed. Do you think Mr. Harris was telling the truth, Grandpa? Mr. Thompson chuckled softly. Let's just say that Mr. Harris isn't the most honest man in town. But don't worry, Samson. We're not done yet. They continued their walk through the town, stopping to chat with various people along the way. Mr. Thompson was careful not to directly accuse anyone, but he asked questions that seemed to put certain individuals on edge. Samson watched in awe as his grandfather subtly gathered information, piecing together the puzzle without ever raising his voice or losing his temper. After what felt like hours of walking and talking, Mr. Thompson finally led Samson back home. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the first stars were beginning to twinkle in the sky. Why didn't you just go to the sheriff, Grandpa? Samson asked as they reached the front porch. Mr. Thompson smiled and shook his head. Sometimes, Samson, the law can only do so much. This isn't just about getting the coin back. It's about understanding why someone would take it in the first place and giving them a chance to make it right. Samson nodded, though he still wasn't sure he completely understood. His grandfather seemed to have a plan, but Samson couldn't see what it was yet. Later that evening, as they sat down to dinner, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Thompson, who had been on edge all day, hurried to answer it. To her surprise, standing on the doorstep was Mr. Harris, looking uncharacteristically nervous. Thompson, I think I might have some information for you, Mr. Harris stammered, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. Mr. Thompson gestured for him to come in. Why don't you join us for dinner, Harris? We can talk over a meal. Mr. Harris hesitated, but eventually stepped inside, taking a seat at the table. The Thompsons served him a plate, and for a few minutes, they ate in silence. Finally, Mr. Harris cleared his throat. Look, Thompson, I wasn't completely honest with you earlier. A man did come by the store today, trying to sell a gold coin. I didn't want to get involved, so I sent him away. But I got the feeling that he was desperate, like he really needed the money. Mr. Thompson nodded, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. Did he say where he was headed next? Mr. Harris shook his head. No, but he mentioned something about needing to get out of town fast. I think he might be planning to leave tonight. Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Thank you, Harris. You've been helpful. Samson watched in awe as his grandfather calmly processed the information. There was no anger, no accusation, just a quiet determination to resolve the situation. After Mr. Harris left, Mr. Thompson turned to Samson. It's time, Samson. Let's go. They left the house and headed towards the edge of town, where the old train station stood. The station was mostly abandoned now, with only a few trains passing through each day. When they arrived, they saw a figure sitting on one of the benches, hunched over and clutching a small bag. As they approached, the figure looked up, revealing a man in his late 30s, with disheveled hair and a weary expression. He looked surprised to see Mr. Thompson and Samson, but he didn't move. Mr. Thompson, the man said, his voice shaky. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same question, Robert, Mr. Thompson replied calmly. But I think I already know the answer. Robert's shoulders slumped, and he sighed heavily. I didn't want to do it, Mr. Thompson. I swear. But I was desperate. My wife is sick, and we don't have the money for her treatment. I didn't know what else to do. Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression softening. Desperation can make people do things they wouldn't normally do. But stealing from others isn't the answer, Robert. There are always other ways. Robert looked down at the ground, shame evident on